Some roads never let you forget what you've seen, and tonight I'm going to share 6 encounters that will make you question everything you thought you knew about America's highways. These aren't your typical ghost stories or urban legends. These are accounts from real truckers who've experienced the inexplicable darkness that travels our interstates after midnight. Each story comes from a different driver, a different route, but they all share one terrifying common thread: the realization that we're never truly alone out there. You think you know what lurks in the shadows between cities, but I promise you, these experiences will shatter every assumption you've ever had about late-night driving. Before we dive into this abyss of highway horror, I need you to understand that what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's the price some pay for making their living on America's loneliest roads. If you're ready to confront the truth about what really travels our highways in the darkness, then subscribe now because you'll want to remember where you heard these stories first. Here's a question that might save your life someday. What do you do when your CB radio starts receiving transmissions from drivers who've been dead for 20 years? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious to know, where are you watching this from tonight, and what time is it in your part of the world? Let me know in the comments below. But here's what I really need you to understand. Once you've heard these stories, you'll never look at 18-wheelers the same way again. Danny Morrison had been driving cross-country routes for 15 years when he made the mistake of stopping for a hitchhiker just outside Bakersfield on a rain-soaked October night. He'd always been the type to help fellow travelers, a habit. His dispatcher constantly warned him against, but something about this particular figure standing under the flickering highway lamp made him slow his rig to a grinding halt. The hitchhiker was a woman, maybe 35, with long dark hair plastered to her skull by the relentless downpour, her clothes soaked through to the point where they clung to her skeletal frame like a second skin. She climbed into the cab, without saying a word, leaving puddles on his passenger seat that seemed far too large for someone who'd only been standing in the rain for a few minutes. Danny tried making conversation as they rolled through the darkness, asking about her destination, where she'd come from, the usual small talk that helped pass the miles, but her responses came in whispers so soft he had to strain to hear them over the rumble of his diesel engine. She spoke about a place called Willowbrook, a town Danny had never heard of despite running California routes for over a decade, and when he asked for more specific directions, she simply pointed ahead into the blackness beyond his headlights. The strangeness began around mile marker 150 when Danny noticed the temperature in his cab had dropped at least 20 degrees, his breath now visible in small puffs despite the heater running full blast. He glanced at his passenger and felt his blood freeze. She was no longer dripping wet, but completely dry, her hair now flowing freely as if blown by some unfelt wind, and her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality that seemed to glow faintly in the dashboard lights. When he asked if she was feeling all right, she turned to look at him with eyes that reflected no light whatsoever, black pits that seemed to absorb everything around them, and spoke in a voice that sounded like water rushing over stones. "I've been waiting so long for someone to take me home." Danny's hands began trembling on the steering wheel as he realized that the road ahead, which should have been familiar Interstate 5, now stretched through landscape he'd never seen before, twisted trees that seemed to reach toward his truck, with gnarled branches and hills that rose and fell in impossible geometric patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. The CB radio crackled to life with static that formed patterns almost like whispered words, and through the interference came a voice Danny didn't recognize. "Driver, you need to pull over now. That passenger of yours ain't what she seems." Danny grabbed his mic with shaking fingers, trying to respond, but before he could speak, the woman beside him placed a hand on his arm, a touch so cold it burned through his flannel shirt like dry ice against bare skin. "Don't listen to them," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats speaking in unison. "They don't understand where we're going." The highway ahead began to curve in ways that defied everything Danny knew about California's straight desert routes. winding through valleys that shouldn't exist, and past exit signs for towns with names written in languages he couldn't identify. His GPS had gone haywire hours ago, spinning wildly between coordinates that placed him simultaneously in Nevada, Arizona, and somewhere off the coast in the Pacific Ocean, while his odometer continued climbing past numbers that should have taken him clear into Mexico by now. Every few miles, Danny caught glimpses in his mirrors of other vehicles following at impossible speeds. 18-wheelers that seemed to float just above the asphalt, their running lights forming patterns that burned afterimages into his retinas, long after he'd looked away. The woman began humming a melody that seemed familiar yet completely alien, a tune that made his teeth ache and caused the metal surfaces in his cab to vibrate with sympathetic resonance, while outside the windshield, the landscape continued its impossible transformation into something that belonged in nightmares rather than any earthly geography. When Danny tried to reach for his logbook to record the increasingly surreal mileage, he found his arms wouldn't obey his commands, his hands locked in position on the steering wheel as if welded there, while his passenger's humming grew louder and more complex, adding harmonies that no human throat should be able to produce. The road signs now appeared in his peripheral vision like brief hallucinations. Willowbrook 50 miles, Willowbrook 25 miles, Willowbrook next exit. But when he tried to focus on them directly, they dissolved into meaningless smears of phosphorescent paint against the darkness. Danny's radio continued receiving transmissions from voices that pleaded with him to stop, to turn around, to do anything but continue toward whatever destination his passenger had chosen. But their words became increasingly distorted until they sounded like screaming wind through canyon walls. The woman's touch on his arm grew heavier, more insistent, and when he dared to glance sideways at her, he saw that her fingers had extended into something resembling roots or tendrils that were slowly working their way beneath his skin, threading through his veins like living wire. The headlights of his truck began to dim despite the alternator showing full charge, and in the growing darkness ahead, Danny could make out the silhouette of what might have been a town, or might have been something wearing a town's shape like an elaborate mask designed to lure travelers off the main highways and into places where different rules applied to time, distance, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. The exit ramp to Willowbrook appeared like a wound in reality, spiraling downward at an angle that seemed to violate basic physics, and as Danny's truck began its descent, he realized with mounting horror that he could no longer feel the steering wheel beneath his hands. His passenger had gone silent, her humming replaced by a sound like distant ocean waves, while her grip on his arm had tightened to the point where he could feel those root-like appendages spreading through his circulatory system, carrying a cold that was slowly numbing his entire body from the inside out. The town that materialized around them bore only the faintest resemblance to any place designed for human habitation. Buildings that rose and curved in architectural impossibilities, streets that branched and merged like river deltas, and streetlights that cast shadows upward into a sky that had taken on the color and consistency of old blood. Danny tried to scream, but found his voice had been stolen, his vocal cords frozen by whatever substance his passenger was injecting into his bloodstream, while his truck continued its automatic navigation through streets that rearranged themselves each time he wasn't looking directly at them. The few pedestrians he glimpsed moved with that same flowing motion as his passenger, their forms shifting and blurring at the edges as if they weren't entirely committed to maintaining human shape, and when they turned to watch his truck pass, their faces held expressions of hunger that transcended anything related to food or earthly desires. His fuel gauge showed empty, had been showing empty for the past 100 miles, yet the engine continued running on something that smelled like ozone and rotting vegetation, while his speedometer needle spun freely between 0 and numbers that extended far beyond the instrument's intended range. The woman began speaking again, but now her words came in a language composed entirely of whispers and sighs, a communication that bypassed his ears entirely and wrote itself directly onto his brain in symbols that hurt to comprehend. Through the windshield, Danny could see their destination approaching. a building that might have once been a truck stop but had grown and twisted into something resembling a massive organic cathedral, its walls pulsing with veins of bioluminescent fluid that provided the only illumination in this lightless town. Other trucks were parked in the lot, dozens of them, their chrome dulled to the color of old bones and their tires flat against asphalt that seemed to be slowly digesting them, while their drivers sat motionless behind darkened windshields like statues commemorating some forgotten tragedy. Danny's passenger finally released her grip on his arm as his truck rolled to a stop, and when he looked down, he saw that the places where her fingers had been were now marked with branching patterns that resembled river systems or neural networks, dark lines that pulsed with their own faint light beneath his increasingly translucent skin. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You can rest here with the others until it's time to make the return journey." As she stepped out of the cab, Danny caught a glimpse of her true form. Something that had never been human, never been bound by the limitations of single-dimensional existence. Something that used the shape of stranded travelers to lure the living into places where the concept of return journey took on meanings that existed far outside human understanding of time, space, and the immutable boundary between life and whatever lay beyond. 3 states away, and 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb was finishing his 3rd consecutive night run from Denver to Chicago when he decided to stop at a truck stop that shouldn't have existed according to every map, GPS system, and guidebook he'd consulted over his 22 years of long-haul driving. The neon sign read Mel's 24-Hour Diner in letters that flickered with the irregular rhythm of a dying heartbeat, casting pools of sickly green light across a parking lot where the asphalt had been cracked into geometric patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed through peripheral vision. Marcus had been fighting exhaustion for the past 4 hours, his eyes burning from staring at an endless ribbon of highway illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional flash of oncoming traffic. So the promise of hot coffee and a place to rest seemed like salvation sent directly from whatever deity watched over interstate truckers. The interior of the diner struck him as oddly familiar despite his certainty that he'd never stopped there before. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches covering tiers that formed symbols resembling ancient hieroglyphs, a jukebox in the corner, playing songs he almost recognized but couldn't quite identify, and a counter where the chrome surfaces reflected images that didn't match the people casting them. Behind the counter stood a waitress who looked like she'd stepped out of a 1950s advertisement, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, her uniform crisp and clean in a way that suggested it had been pressed moments before his arrival. And when she smiled at him, Marcus noticed that her teeth were just slightly too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "Coffee, Han?" she asked in a voice that carried the cadence of a different era. "Or are you looking for something more substantial to keep you going through the night?" Marcus slid onto a stool and ordered black coffee and apple pie. Standard trucker. Fare that had sustained him through countless midnight stops. But when the waitress set his order before him, he noticed that the coffee's surface reflected not the diner's overhead lights but what appeared to be stars arranged in constellations he didn't recognize. The pie, when he took his first bite, tasted exactly like his grandmother's recipe from 30 years ago, complete with the slight hint of cinnamon that she'd always added despite never admitting it to anyone. And for a moment, Marcus felt tears welling in his eyes as memories he'd thought long buried came flooding back with impossible clarity. Other customers occupied several booths throughout the diner, truck drivers like himself, based on their appearance and the CB radio chatter that drifted from their direction, but something about their conversations troubled Marcus in ways he couldn't articulate. Discussions about routes that had been decommissioned decades ago, loads they were hauling to companies that had gone out of business during the Carter administration, and delivery schedules that referenced dates from years that hadn't occurred yet. When Marcus tried to check his watch to see how long he'd been sitting there, he found that the hands had stopped moving entirely, frozen at 11:47 p.m., despite the feeling that hours had passed since he'd entered the establishment, while outside, the windows, the darkness had taken on a quality that suggested it might be permanent rather than simply the absence of daylight. The waitress refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and Marcus noticed that the liquid never seemed to diminish no matter how much he drank, maintaining the same level as if the cup were somehow connected to an infinite reservoir of the bitter, too-hot beverage that tasted increasingly like motor oil mixed with memories of better times. The conversations around him grew more distinct as his hearing seemed to sharpen beyond normal human limits, and Marcus began to understand that the other customers weren't discussing their current runs, but rather trips they'd completed years or decades ago, routes through territories that no longer existed on any contemporary map, deliveries to destinations that had been swallowed by urban development or natural disasters long before Marcus had even gotten his CDL. A heavy-set driver in a booth near the window was detailing his regular run between Detroit and a steel mill in Pennsylvania that had closed in 1982, speaking about it as if he'd completed the route just yesterday, while his companion nodded knowingly and shared stories about hauling lumber to construction projects that had been finished before Marcus was born. When Marcus tried to stand and leave, he found that his muscles wouldn't respond to his commands, his body seemingly rooted to the diner stool by forces that operated beyond mere physical laws, while his mind remained crystal clear and increasingly panicked as he began to understand the true nature of his situation. The jukebox in the corner began playing a song that Marcus recognized as his father's favorite, a tune from 1963 that had been playing on the radio the night his old man died behind the wheel of his own rig on this very stretch of highway. And as the melody filled the diner, the other customers began to turn and look at Marcus with expressions of welcome that carried undertones of infinite sadness. "You're new here," said the heavy-set driver, rising from his booth and approaching with movements that seemed slightly out of sync with time itself. "But don't worry, the routes never really end. They just change destinations." Marcus tried to speak, to scream, to do anything that might break the spell that had settled over him like a burial shroud, but his vocal cords had become as unresponsive as his limbs, leaving him trapped inside his own body while his consciousness remained fully aware of everything happening around him. The waitress appeared beside him with a clipboard and a pen that looked like it had been manufactured sometime during the Eisenhower administration, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "Just need you to sign in, hun. For our records, nothing more permanent than what you've already committed to by walking through our door." Through the diner's windows, Marcus could see his truck in the parking lot, but now it appeared aged and weathered as if decades had passed in the minutes since he'd parked it. The chrome dulled to pewter, the paint faded to primer gray, and the tires slowly sinking into asphalt that had begun to resemble quicksand more than any road surface designed for vehicular traffic. The clipboard in front of him contained page after page of signatures in various handwritings, some in ink that had faded to brown, others so fresh they seemed to glisten wet in the diner's fluorescent lighting, and as Marcus's paralyzed hand was guided to sign his own name at the bottom of the current page, he realized with crystal clarity that he had just committed himself to a delivery route that would never end, hauling cargo between destinations that existed only in the spaces, between what the living world considered real. The signature completed itself in handwriting that wasn't quite his own, the letters flowing across the page with flourishes and curves that belonged to someone else's muscle memory, while the ink seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating words that appeared to be carved into the paper rather than written upon its surface. As soon as the pen lifted from the clipboard, Marcus felt sensation returning to his body, but it was sensation filtered through different parameters than anything he'd experienced during his 43 years of life. He could feel the weight of years that hadn't passed yet pressing against his shoulders, could taste the metallic residue of conversations he'd never had with people he'd never meet, and could smell the distinctive odor of cargo he'd transport to places that existed only in the theoretical spaces between established geography. The other customers in the diner had resumed their conversations, but now Marcus understood their words with perfect clarity. Discussions about hauling loads of crystallized time from the border between Tuesday and Wednesday to a warehouse located at the intersection of memory and forgetting, about delivering shipments of bottled dreams to addresses that existed only during the 3 minutes between sleeping and waking, and about making runs that measured distance not in miles, but in degrees of separation from everything they'd ever known to be real. The waitress smiled at him with those 2 sharp teeth and handed him a set of keys that felt warm to the touch despite being made of metal that had been cooled beyond the reach of normal temperature scales, keys that belonged to a truck he'd never driven but somehow knew intimately, a vehicle that existed in the parking lot outside, despite having been manufactured in a factory that operated according to blueprints drawn up in dimensions where the concept of manufacturing held meanings that transcended mere physical assembly. Marcus stood from his stool and walked toward the diner's exit, his movements feeling simultaneously automatic and deliberate, as if he were following a script written by someone who understood his motivations better than he did himself. While, behind him, the other customers offered words of encouragement and advice about routes he'd never traveled, but would soon know better than the highways of his former life. The door chimed as he stepped outside into air that tasted of ozone and possibilities, and there in the parking lot sat his new truck, a Kenworth that gleamed with chrome that reflected not the diner's neon lighting, but the ghostly illumination of aurora that shouldn't exist at this latitude, its trailer loaded with cargo that shifted and whispered behind aluminum walls that were somehow both transparent and completely opaque, depending on the angle of observation. As Marcus climbed into the cab and turned the ignition, he felt the last threads of his connection to his previous existence snap like overstretched rubber bands, leaving him free to begin a career that would take him to places that had never appeared on any earthly map, but had been waiting patiently for drivers qualified to handle deliveries that operated according to the strange physics of spaces between spaces, times between times, and the curious intersections where the impossible became merely improbable, and the improbable became just another day's work for those who'd signed their names in the ledger of eternal employment. 2,700 miles northeast of Marcus's surrender to an employment contract written in disappearing ink, Gerald Hartman was experiencing his own encounter with the kind of phenomena that made seasoned truckers switch to day shifts and local routes. Gerald had been running the same stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska for 8 years, a monotonous but reliable route that paid decent money for hauling agricultural equipment between Omaha and Des Moines. But on this particular November night, the familiar landmarks had begun shifting into configurations that challenged his understanding of geography, physics, and the fundamental reliability of asphalt and concrete infrastructure. Mile marker 187 had become a point of reference that refused to behave according to normal spatial rules. Gerald first noticed it around 2:30 a.m. when he passed what appeared to be the aftermath of a major accident, a jackknifed semi-blocking. Both eastbound lanes with emergency vehicles surrounding the wreckage like metal vultures feeding on twisted steel and spilled diesel fuel. He'd slowed to merge into the left lane, expecting to see paramedics and state troopers directing traffic around the scene. But as he drew closer, Gerald realized that the emergency vehicles bore logos and paint schemes from departments that had updated their designs decades ago, while the wrecked truck was a model that had gone out of production sometime during the Reagan administration. The accident scene disappeared in his rearview mirror with an abruptness that violated every principle of perspective and distance Gerald had learned during his years of highway driving, as if someone had simply switched off the lights on a stage set, leaving nothing but empty asphalt stretching behind him under the pale glow of sodium vapor lighting that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. When Gerald checked his odometer, he discovered that he'd traveled exactly 13 miles since passing the wreckage, which should have put him well beyond mile marker 200, but the green reflective sign emerging from the darkness ahead read mile 187 in numbers that seemed to pulse with their own internal light source. The CB radio had been quiet all evening, unusual for a route that normally carried steady chatter from other long-haul drivers. But as Gerald approached the mile marker for what he was certain was the second time in less than 20 minutes, Channel 19 crackled to life with a transmission that made his blood run cold. Eastbound Kenworth approaching 187. You need to get off this highway now. That accident you saw is going to happen again in exactly 17 minutes, and this time, you're going to be part of it." Gerald grabbed his mic and tried to respond, asking for identification and clarification, but the radio had returned to its ominous silence, leaving him alone with the growing realization that he was trapped in some kind of temporal loop that centered around mile marker 187 and the accident that both had and hadn't occurred there. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, the same reading it had displayed when he'd first encountered the wreckage, and his clock had stopped at 2:47 a.m., despite the feeling that hours had passed since he'd begun this impossible journey through a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien to everything he thought he knew about the stretch of highway he'd traveled thousands of times before. The third time Gerald passed mile marker 187, he made the decision to pull over and investigate on foot, reasoning that whatever supernatural forces were manipulating his perception of time and distance might be less effective against someone who wasn't enclosed in several tons of steel and diesel-powered momentum. He parked his rig on the shoulder approximately 50 yards before the mile marker, activated his hazard lights, and stepped out into air that carried the distinctive smell of burned rubber and spilled fuel despite the absence of any visible accident scene. The highway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated by overhead lighting that cast pools of amber visibility separated by gulfs of absolute darkness, while the only sound was the distant hum of electrical transformers and the whisper of wind through the tall grass that bordered the interstate. Gerald walked toward mile marker 187 with the caution of someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal, his feet crunching on gravel that seemed unusually sharp and reflective, as if each stone had been cut from some mineral that didn't exist in normal geological formations. As he drew closer to the mile marker, Gerald began to notice details that had been invisible from his cab. The metal post was scored with scratches that formed patterns resembling tally marks, as if someone had been keeping count of something for years or decades, while the reflective green sign itself bore stains that looked disturbingly like rust, but gave off the metallic smell of blood that had been exposed to air for far too long. The moment Gerald's hand touched the mile marker post, reality convulsed around him like a film strip that had been damaged and repaired multiple times, showing him flashes of the same stretch of highway across different time periods. The accident, scene he'd witnessed earlier, but also variations of the same event occurring with different vehicles, different drivers, different outcomes, but always the same basic configuration of twisted metal and emergency response that arrived too late to prevent tragedy, but just in time to bear witness to its aftermath. Gerald saw his own truck approaching in one of these temporal echoes, watched himself attempt to merge around wreckage that materialized directly in front of his hood, witnessed the jackknife sequence that would send his trailer sliding sideways across both lanes of traffic while his cab rolled 3 times before coming to rest upside down in the median with diesel fuel pooling around the wreckage like blood around a fresh wound. The visions came faster and more violently, showing him dozens of accidents at this exact location, each one occurring at precisely 2:47 a.m. on different nights across multiple years, a repeating pattern of mechanical failure, human error, and circumstances that transformed a routine stretch of interstate into a supernatural trap that fed on the kinetic energy of collision and the life force of those who died in the twisted wreckage. Gerald tried to release his grip on the mile marker post, but found that his hand had become fused to the metal surface through some process that bypassed normal physical laws, while the visions continued their relentless assault on his sanity, showing him not just the accidents, but the drivers who experienced them. Men and women like himself who had been trapped in this same temporal loop, forced to relive their final moments until they accepted their fate and allowed the accident to claim them permanently. The revelation struck Gerald with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't experiencing some random supernatural phenomenon, but rather had become part of a harvesting system that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension, a mechanism that used the repetitive nature of highway travel to create stable temporal loops where the same tragic events could be replayed indefinitely until they achieved the desired outcome. His hand remained welded to the mile marker post by forces that seemed to draw strength from his growing panic, while the visions continued their bombardment of his consciousness, showing him the faces of every driver who had died at this location, their expressions frozen in moments of realization that came too late to prevent the inevitable collision that would add their names to whatever cosmic ledger kept track of souls claimed by this particular stretch of Interstate 80. Gerald could feel his own life force being drawn into the mile marker through his palm, a sensation like having his blood slowly replaced with liquid mercury that carried information instead of oxygen, knowledge about the true nature of America's highway system and the entities that used it as a feeding ground for harvesting the psychic energy generated by human trauma and violent death. The accident scenes playing in his mind began to include variations where different drivers had made different choices. Some had tried to turn around and drive back the way they'd come, only to find that the road behind them had disappeared into a void that stretched beyond the reach of their headlights. Others had attempted to abandon their vehicles and flee on foot through the surrounding grasslands, only to discover that the landscape repeated itself in endless iterations that always led back to mile marker 187 and the appointment that had been scheduled for them since the moment they'd chosen to take this route. Gerald's watch had begun running backward, its hands spinning counterclockwise through time toward 2:47 a.m. with mechanical precision that suggested the device was no longer measuring duration, but rather counting down to a predetermined conclusion, while his body temperature dropped steadily as more of his essential heat was absorbed by the mile marker post that had become both anchor and drain for whatever process was transforming him from living driver to permanent resident of this temporal anomaly. The CB radio in his truck began broadcasting a message in his own voice, a transmission he'd never made but recognized with horrifying clarity. Westbound drivers approaching mile 187. There's been an accident in the eastbound lanes. Massive pileup. With multiple fatalities, you'll want to slow down and be careful when you pass the scene. Gerald understood that he was hearing his own future, the warning he would broadcast to other drivers once he'd been fully integrated into the system that operated this supernatural trap, his voice adding to the chorus of the previously claimed, who used their eternal servitude to lure new victims into the same temporal loop that had captured their own final moments and transformed them into tools for perpetuating a cycle that had been running since the first fatal accident had occurred at this location decades ago. But Gerald Hartman possessed something that previous victims had lacked, a stubborn streak that had sustained him through 8 years of long-haul driving and 2 failed marriages, a refusal to accept defeat that had kept him on the road when lesser drivers had quit for easier careers, and most importantly, a CB radio that he'd modified with components purchased from a trucker in Montana who claimed to have experience with unusual frequency phenomena encountered on certain stretches of remote highway. As the mile marker post continued its drain on his life force and the countdown on his watch approached the fatal moment of 2:47 a.m., Gerald managed to activate the emergency override switch he'd installed on his radio, a modification that boosted his transmission power far beyond legal limits and allowed him to broadcast on frequencies reserved for emergency services and military communications. His voice, distorted by the massive power surge but still recognizably human, cut through the supernatural static that had been blocking normal CB traffic. This is Gerald Hartman, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. I am trapped in a temporal anomaly at mile marker 187 on Interstate 80 eastbound. This location is harvesting truck drivers through manufactured accidents. Repeat. Mile marker 187 is a supernatural trap that creates fatal accidents at 2:47 a.m. Any drivers approaching this location should exit immediately and take alternate routes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emergency frequencies that had been silent for decades suddenly came alive with transmissions from state police, emergency management coordinators, and highway maintenance crews who had been waiting for someone to break through the communication blackout that had surrounded this section of Interstate 80 for over 30 years. Gerald's unauthorized broadcast had apparently triggered some kind of fail-safe system that had been put in place by authorities who knew about the supernatural trap but had been powerless to intervene directly, limited to monitoring the situation, and waiting for a victim strong enough to break the communication barrier from inside the temporal loop. As official response teams mobilized toward his location, Gerald felt the mile marker post's grip on his hand beginning to weaken, its drain on his life force interrupted by the sudden influx of attention from the outside world, while the visions of repeated accidents began to fracture and dissolve like images reflected in water that had been disturbed by thrown stones. His truck's engine started itself and began idling with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat, ready to carry him away from this place once he could free himself from the metal post that had been holding him prisoner. But Gerald realized that escape would come with a price. Knowledge about the true nature of America's highway system that would make it impossible for him to drive any route without wondering what other supernatural traps were waiting for unwary travelers who made their living on the nation's interconnected web of interstate commerce. The clock on his dashboard jumped forward to 3:15 a.m., breaking free from the temporal loop that had held it frozen at the moment of scheduled catastrophe, while behind him, Gerald could hear the approaching sirens of emergency vehicles that belonged to his own time rather than echoes from accidents that had occurred decades in the past. 6 months after Gerald Hartman's escape from mile marker 187 and 3,000 miles away in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, Rebecca Chen was learning that some CB radio frequencies carry more than just voices of living truckers seeking company during the long midnight hours between cities. Rebecca had been driving solo routes for only 2 years, but she'd earned respect among veteran drivers for her professionalism, reliability, and her habit of monitoring emergency frequencies in addition to the standard trucker channels, a practice that had allowed her to assist in several rescue operations when other drivers had broken down in remote areas or encountered weather emergencies. On this particular night, she was hauling a load of electronics from Atlanta to Pittsburgh, taking Route 40 through mountain passes that offered spectacular views during daylight hours but transformed into narrow ribbons of asphalt bordered by guardrails and steep drops that disappeared into absolute darkness beyond the reach of her headlights. The first unusual transmission came through around 1:30 a.m. as Rebecca navigated a series of switchbacks that climbed toward the highest elevation on her route, a voice cutting through the static on Channel 19 with unusual clarity considering the mountainous terrain that normally interfered with radio communications. Eastbound driver in the blue Peterbilt, you need to be aware that Route 40 east of Crossville has been closed due to a chemical spill. Hazmat teams are on scene, but they're estimating at least 6 hours before the road reopens. Rebecca checked her maps and GPS, both of which showed Route 40 as clear and open, with no construction or emergency notifications. But the voice on the radio had mentioned details specific to her truck that suggested the transmission was directed specifically at her rather than being a general traffic advisory. She tried to respond, asking for clarification and requesting the identity of the driver who had provided the warning, but her transmission seemed to disappear into a void of static that absorbed her words without producing the usual echo that indicated her signal was being received and processed by the standard repeater network. As Rebecca continued climbing through the mountain passes, additional transmissions began filtering through her CB radio, each one claiming to be from drivers who were traveling the same route, but reporting conditions that contradicted everything she could observe through her windshield. Warnings about ice storms that weren't occurring, advisories about construction zones that didn't exist, and detailed descriptions of accidents that would require her to take detours through areas that appeared on no map she'd ever consulted. The voices all carried the distinctive cadence and terminology of experienced truck drivers, but something about their transmissions felt fundamentally wrong, as if the words were being spoken by people who had learned trucker slang from textbooks, rather than acquiring it through years of actual highway experience. And when Rebecca tried to engage any of the voices in the kind of casual conversation that normally filled the empty hours of long-distance driving, their responses came back stilted and formal, lacking the natural flow of human communication. The realization began forming in Rebecca's mind as she passed the third non-existent construction zone that had been described in perfect detail by voices. On her CB radio, she was receiving transmissions from drivers who were no longer among the living, ghostly communications from truckers who had died on this route, but continued broadcasting warnings and advisories to travelers who followed the same mountain highways where they'd met their ends. The evidence accumulated with each mile, references to truck stops that had been demolished years ago, discussions of fuel prices that hadn't been valid since the 1990s, and, most disturbing of all, increasingly specific warnings about hazards that were always located just beyond Rebecca's current position, as if the phantom voices were trying to guide her towards some predetermined destination that held significance in the supernatural geography of these mountain roads. Rebecca's CB radio began picking up what sounded like an entire network of deceased drivers, their voices overlapping in conversations that spanned decades of highway history, discussions about loads they'd hauled to companies that no longer existed, routes through territories that had been altered by highway expansion projects completed long after their deaths, and detailed knowledge of road conditions that existed only in the memories of drivers who had been buried in cemeteries, scattered across states they'd never see again. The Phantom Network seemed to operate according to its own logic, with established protocols for reporting hazards, coordinating convoy movements, and sharing information about routes that connected not just physical locations, but temporal waypoints, where past and present intersected in ways that allowed communication between the living and the dead. Rebecca found herself drawn into their conversations despite her growing fear, responding to requests for position reports and road condition updates as if she were participating in a normal trucking network rather than serving as a living relay point for spirits who had refused to abandon the highways that had claimed their lives. The mountain passes began to feel increasingly familiar, despite her certainty that she'd never driven this specific route before, as if the phantom voices were sharing their memories of the terrain, along with their warnings and advisories, downloading decades of accumulated knowledge directly into her consciousness through the medium of CB radio transmission. Her fuel gauge started behaving erratically, showing readings that fluctuated between full and empty without any logical pattern, while her speedometer registered speeds that didn't match her perception of her truck's actual velocity, as if the instruments were picking up signals from vehicles that existed in different time frames but occupied the same physical space. The phantom voices grew more insistent as Rebecca approached what her GPS identified as the highest point on her route, warning her about specific hazards that would manifest at precise mile markers, providing detailed instructions for navigating obstacles that hadn't materialized yet but felt inevitable given the supernatural accuracy of their previous predictions. When Rebecca tried to exit the Phantom Network by switching her CB radio to different channels, she discovered that the voices followed her across all frequencies, their transmission somehow overriding normal broadcasting protocols to maintain contact with the only living driver who had managed to establish communication with their post-mortem network. The mountain darkness beyond her headlights began to pulse with lights that belonged to trucks she couldn't see directly, phantom vehicles traveling parallel routes through dimensions that intersected with her physical highway at points where the boundary between life and death had been worn thin by decades of fatal accidents, mechanical failures, and the accumulated psychic energy of drivers who had died alone on remote stretches of mountain road far from any possibility of rescue or human contact. The summit of the mountain pass revealed a truck stop that appeared on no contemporary map but glowed with the warm light of sodium vapor lamps and neon signs advertising fuel prices from 30 years in the past, while the parking lot held an assembly of trucks representing every major manufacturer and model that had operated on American highways since the interstate system's creation in the 1950s. Rebecca found her truck pulling into the lot without conscious direction from her hands, on the steering wheel, as if her vehicle had been programmed to recognize this location as a mandatory stop, despite her growing certainty that the truck stop existed in some liminal space between normal reality and whatever realm served as a final destination for truckers, who had died with unfinished runs on their logbooks. The phantom voices on her CB radio welcomed her arrival with congratulations and invitations to join them for coffee and conversation, their transmissions now coming from the direction of the truck stop rather than from invisible vehicles traveling parallel routes through supernatural highway networks. Rebecca shut off her engine and sat in her cab for several minutes, weighing her options and trying to understand the true nature of her situation. She could attempt to restart her truck and continue toward Pittsburgh, risking whatever consequences might follow from rejecting the phantom driver's hospitality, or she could accept their invitation and discover what happened to living truckers who entered establishments that catered to the transportation needs of the deceased. The decision was ultimately made for her when she realized that her truck's ignition wouldn't respond to her key, the engine remaining silent despite multiple attempts to start it, while outside her windows the phantom trucks began repositioning themselves to block any possible exit routes from the parking lot. Rebecca opened her cab door and stepped onto asphalt that felt solid beneath her feet, but gave off the distinctive smell of earth that had been recently disturbed, as if the parking lot had been constructed over a graveyard without proper attention to the spiritual significance of the displaced remains. The truck stop's interior matched its exterior in terms of temporal displacement, featuring a lunch counter with stools upholstered in vinyl that had gone out of style during the Eisenhower administration, a jukebox playing songs that hadn't been recorded yet, and a cash register that accepted payment in currency that had been discontinued decades ago but somehow remained legal tender in this particular establishment. Behind the counter stood a man who looked familiar despite Rebecca's certainty that she'd never met him before, his face carrying the weathered features of someone who had spent decades behind the wheel of long-haul trucks, and when he spoke, his voice matched one of the phantom transmissions she'd been receiving throughout her journey up the mountain pass. "Welcome to the Last Stop Diner. We've been expecting you for quite some time now, and we're hoping you'll consider staying with us permanently rather than trying to complete that run to Pittsburgh that's been weighing on your manifest." The man behind the counter introduced himself as Tommy Rodriguez, a name that Rebecca recognized from CB radio folklore as belonging to a legendary driver who had disappeared somewhere in these mountains during the late 1970s while hauling a load of construction equipment that had never reached its destination, becoming part of the oral tradition that connected truckers across generational lines through stories of mysterious vanishings and supernatural encounters on America's most remote highways. Tommy poured coffee into a mug that felt warm to the touch despite appearing to be made of the same ceramic material that had absorbed decades of ambient temperature from the truck stop's atmosphere. And, as Rebecca tasted the bitter liquid, she realized that it carried flavors and memories that belonged to every cup of coffee she'd ever consumed during her trucking career, as if the beverage had been distilled from her own experiences rather than prepared using conventional brewing methods. The other customers in the Last Stop Diner began introducing themselves with names that corresponded to missing driver reports that had accumulated in law enforcement databases over the past 50 years, men and women who had vanished while traveling routes that intersected with this mountain pass, their trucks found abandoned or never located at all, their fates becoming cautionary tales shared among drivers who understood that some roads led to destinations that weren't marked on any officially sanctioned map. Rebecca learned that the Phantom CB network she'd been monitoring was actually a recruiting system designed to identify living drivers who possessed the psychological profile necessary for successful integration into the post-mortem trucking industry, a supernatural logistics operation that handled cargo and delivery schedules for clients whose business interests extended beyond the limitations of conventional space-time boundaries. The loads they hauled consisted of conceptual materials that couldn't be transported by living drivers, shipments of crystallized memories between past and future versions of the same locations, deliveries of emotional resonance that maintained the psychic connections binding communities across temporal distances, and emergency runs, carrying essential hope to areas that had been temporarily isolated from the normal flow of positive human experience. Tommy explained that Rebecca's recruitment had been in progress since she'd first obtained her commercial driver's license, monitored through a network of phantom drivers who evaluated potential candidates based on their responses to unusual situations, their willingness to help fellow truckers in distress, and, most importantly, their ability to maintain professional standards even when confronted with circumstances that challenged their understanding of reality's fundamental operating principles. The decision to join their organization was technically voluntary, but Tommy made it clear that rejection would result in complications that would make it impossible for Rebecca to continue her career as a living trucker, including mechanical failures that would strand her in remote locations, cargo that would disappear from her trailer during routine stops, and dispatchers who would gradually lose the ability to see her name in their computer systems until she became as invisible to the conventional trucking industry as she would be to the normal world of human social interaction. Rebecca Chen signed her name in the ledger using a pen that wrote in ink the color of midnight on mountain highways, officially joining a transportation network that operated outside the constraints of physics, economics, and the conventional boundaries between life and death, while simultaneously accepting a position that would allow her to continue doing the work she loved under employment conditions that offered job security extending far beyond the normal human lifespan. The contract specified routes that connected not just geographic locations, but emotional states, temporal periods, and dimensional frameworks where the concept of delivery encompassed responsibilities for maintaining the spiritual infrastructure that kept America's highways functional for both living and deceased travelers who depended on the road system for purposes ranging from simple commerce to the eternal migration of souls seeking resolution for unfinished business. Her first assignment involved hauling a trailer loaded with bottled silence from a monastery in Colorado to a crisis counseling center in Virginia, cargo that would provide emotional insulation for trauma survivors who needed protection from the overwhelming noise of their own psychological healing processes. A delivery that required navigation through routes that existed primarily in the spaces between conscious thought and unconscious memory, where conventional mapping systems had no jurisdiction, but phantom CB networks provided precise coordination for drivers who understood that some destinations could only be reached by travelers who had surrendered their attachment to purely physical existence. As Rebecca climbed back into her truck, now equipped with modifications that allowed it to operate using fuel distilled from moonlight and determination rather than conventional diesel, she realized that her new career would involve challenges and responsibilities that exceeded anything she'd encountered during her years as a living driver, but would also provide opportunities to serve communities and individuals whose needs couldn't be addressed through normal commercial transportation networks. The phantom voices on her CB radio welcomed her to the organization with congratulations and practical advice about handling supernatural cargo, maintaining equipment that operated according to metaphysical principles, and developing the professional relationships that would sustain her through delivery schedules measured in decades rather than days, while the mountain highway ahead stretched toward destinations that existed beyond the reach of ordinary maps, but within the territory covered by drivers who had learned to navigate using stars that appeared only to the dead and road signs written in languages that predated human speech. So remember, when you're driving alone through those empty hours between midnight and dawn, when your CB radio starts picking up transmissions from drivers who sound just a little too distant, just a little too familiar with routes that shouldn't exist, maybe you should consider whether that voice asking for your position report is coming from someone who's still counting miles in the world of the living. Subscribe if you're still listening, and leave a comment if you've ever wondered what cargo those phantom trucks are really hauling through the darkness beyond your headlights. Sweet dreams, and may your next journey take you only where you're supposed to go.